Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Todd Talks. We are now firmly in the grasp of 2021, thankfully. And we are talking about Dungeon Master's tools that you'll find in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I am joined by the esteemed Mr. B. Dave Walters and James Haeck, our lead writer over at D&D Beyond. Say hello, everyone.
James Haeck.
Hello, hello.
Can we at least agree that we escaped the clutches of 2020?
You're right.
Like whether or not we're firmly in the grip of 2021.
Let's say warm embrace. Warm embrace
right.
of 2021.
Okay. We're still in the honeymoon phase. It's still new.
Listen, you know? I'll be grasped, hugged, hooked.
As long as we're not in the vile clutches anymore. Right. Anything is fine.
Exactly. Yeah, okay. Upgrade complete.
I'll take any grasping tentacle or eldritch blast, wherever, that will get me into 2021. So
I appreciate we all got the wardrobe note here. You know, we're all like it's a mode, it's a look we have going here. That's a good thing. Yeah. Goatees and black outfits.
Well, I don't think I wear anything else. So we're talking about because we have a lot of new dungeon masters out there. A lot of people are learning D&D and just tabletop in general. And so this is a very good way to start the beginning of 2021 and talking about something that is very fundamental and will make a really huge difference in anyone's game. It's session zero. I cannot outline how important this is. This is not, episode one of your game that you're playing with your players, but you as a dungeon master and you as a player should want to do this because you will learn a lot about your character, a lot about your limits, what you don't like, and you're probably going to learn a lot more after session zero as well. So this all really begins at having this conversation with the dungeon master. How do both of you start this conversation? B. Dave?
Oh, yes. Well, it's on, obviously sometimes I'm on the DM's chair, sometimes I'm on the player chair. At this point, I've been lucky to play enough D&D that I'm comfortable literally in any role. So a lot of times my first conversation with the DM is what does the story require? Like is there anything missing? Party balance in 5th edition is not nearly as restrictive as it was in past editions, where it's like, oh, you've got to have the healer, you've got to have the tank, you've got to have the rogue, not so much anymore. But so I find a lot of that now is more narrative driven, where, for instance, your storyteller might come back to you and say, it would really help me if there was at least one Aasimar. So, so that's going to plug into the narrative in a certain way. Or if there's a Ghostwise halfling that grew up in the region or something like that. That's usually where I start with those conversations and then build out from there. I mean, I always sit. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to jump in on this point you're making about a player who has seen both sides of the table talking to the DM about what's narratively expedient, because that's absolutely the sort of thing that a session zero is great for establishing, because there are lots of players who won't want to do that. And there are a lot of DMs out there who won't want to do that, like people who are really into crafting a story kind of as a chronicle of events rather than as a plot that moves forward. And they might even get frustrated if characters want to serve the narrative rather than kind of letting the narrative wash out later on. There are so many different expectations and assumptions and prejudices and baked in biases that everyone brings to the table on their own, that session zero is a perfect place for everyone to really lay bare all of the things that they think D&D or your RPG of choice is. Because otherwise, some people may end up disappointed when their expectations aren't being met.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that definitely. If nothing else, if absolutely nothing else, making sure everybody's on the same page about what this campaign's supposed to be. I mean, if somebody is expecting eldritch horror in the vein of Ravenloft and somebody else is happy-go-lucky, I'm the pudgy halfling who's going to steal every pie I ever see, that could be a recipe for chaos. So having those expectations is also good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree on that point of it is delightful when a player and to be that player when you ask the DM, like, how can I serve that narrative? Because as you mentioned, like, Aasimar can often get impressions and dreams associated. And anytime you give that kind of opening to a DM of like, okay, I can send, these visions on occasion to kind of move the plot forward. This is a good way to get buy-in from a dungeon master as well, who maybe does tend to be very focused on the chronicle of their writing, and sometimes maybe not necessarily forgets their players along the way, but this is a good way to hook in.
Yeah. Although
a great way to work together.
I will say, though, even though I just said that I do that as a player and I do as a DM, both of you have experienced this where it's like, well, do you have any preference what I play? I'm like, do literally anything. Like, I will adjust to you. Just do whatever you want. I will make it work. So it's funny that I'm like, on the one hand, how can I serve you in your narrative? But on the other hand, now you do what you want, though, and it's going to be all right. So yeah.
I think you and I have gone to the point where we appreciate the chaos. Mm-hmm. Like having to adapt is always a nice surprise. So this all comes down to the character and party creation, and like you said, like D&D is far more forgiving about party balance. Certainly if someone really loves healing and that's their kind of identity, that can happen in a group where like, that's what I want to be doing. That's why I want to be the important person because I'm the core healer. That's another conversation. But like a cleric can go full on attack mode all the time, never heal, and be totally fine in D&D now.
And it wasn't like that. For those of you that like, I'm like, for you, don't remember back in my day, certain roles were just vital. If you didn't have them, you just might as well not even go into the dungeon. Yeah, right. So
it was like a hard rain and everyone died in the village.
Yeah. Sorry, Joey. I think, James, you're about to say something and I cut you off there, brother. Sorry.
No. There are just so many things to talk about with Session Zero. I feel like I want to try and give a broad overview of the topic because we've kind of jumped right into a useful and specific aspect of it, but there's such a huge umbrella of things that can be covered in a preliminary session like this.
Yeah.
That like, you can talk about game stuff like this, the mechanical dynamics of who everyone wants to play and what kind of story are we looking for, that sort of thing. But there's a major dynamic of Session Zero, and I think it's usually what people think of when you talk about Session Zero, that involves safety tools when it comes to RPGs as well. And this is especially true when you're playing with a group who you've never ever played with before, but also true when you're just starting a new campaign. Like B-Dave, you brought up horror and Ravenloft, and horror is a great place to talk about safety tools and things like that, because the joy of horror is, getting into a situation that would normally be deathly terrifying and gaining some sort of enjoyment out of it. But one person's fun, cathartic horror is another person's deeply, like, legitimately psychologically triggering event. And if you want to play Strahd to the hilt as the suave sexual abuser that vampires can be, like, you want to make sure that everyone on your table is okay with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a massive thing that you really, really should be doing, and also understand that this kind of comes down to that social contract around the table. This can be a moving target depending on the times that you're living in and what is happening in each person's personal life. As a dungeon master, I probably wouldn't recommend, if someone's going through a terrible breakup, to have them deal with a breakup, say, in the game.
Right.
I just had this experience. It wasn't D&D, but it was Wraith. And Wraith is all about digging into a lot of the most terrible aspects of what makes a person. And one of my players was going through a complex personal situation. And I did pull them aside and was like, hey, so and they were like, no, I want to do it. And then afterwards, after we'd gone through it all, they were like, even I didn't know if I could handle it, but it actually helped me. And I think that's, if I had to describe like Session Zero as a concept from top to bottom, it is just an opportunity to make sure everybody's on the same page, just whatever that is. It's a time to pick character classes, to discuss like the macro plot of the story, the setting, the themes, the pre-existing interpersonal connections between the characters. which also helps. When you sit down and you're like, hey man, do you want to be brothers? Do you want to be that we are betrothed? Do you want to be the bitterest of enemies? Because that actually can be kind of exciting if there's a reason at the beginning why we're forced to cooperate, but Wernstrom, as long as everybody agrees to that, though.
Yeah, that's always deeply fun. I started a campaign off like with two characters who deeply hated each other, and it was just continuously hilarious because it was very much a Han Solo versus Lando kind of situation that they walked in, and before the friendship had congealed, I would say, and it got played into over and over and over again that these two characters were in constant competition, and it was really fun.
I do want to clarify one thing, though, especially with my halfling pie stealer comment earlier. There are that's going to be my next character, y'all. Halfling pie stealer, or I'll just have Freely. It's just going to go on a pie stealing spree. There are room at the table for different character concepts, like especially when you look at iconic stories like Dragonlance, where you have Caramon and Raceland, but you also have Tasselhoff, who is still vital to the narrative, but everyone still needs to make sure you're all rowing in the same direction, though. I guess just to clarify, there's not that everybody has to play silly or everybody has to play grimdark or whatever. Just make sure it all meshes.
In fact, having that character, when you're all trying to figure out the type of game you want to play and having, in that setting, this is what was great about Tasselhoff Burfoot in, say, Dragonlance, was that there are deeply horrifying and dark moments facing Lord Soth. Going to the Tower of High Sorceries, I always pronounce it Shoiken Grove, where there's extreme fear. And even Tasselhoff, who is immune to fear, is like, I don't like this. This is a creepy feeling. That lets you know how bad things have gotten. Where angels fear to tread. It's they become the canary in the coal mine for a lot of people. So if, say, Freely is like, maybe I shouldn't jump in here. When
he's like, maybe we shouldn't fight this dude, you're like, wait, what? I agree.
When he gets really kind of shy and quiet, he's like, I don't know about this. But yeah, it's a good opportunity, I think, also at the beginning to like talk about like your character backgrounds and your bonds and all that stuff, because those can overlap. Like, if you're a pirate, if you're a charlatan, that can kind of inform where you guys are going as well as a group very quickly. And certainly there's group patrons that you'll find in Tasha's, which is a very easy way to get things started. Like, hey, I have an adventure for you. You all have the same quest giver. But they do have like some. I actually like some of these choices. You could have the characters grow up together and have known each other for years, which is very much the Dragonlance way of starting things. We've got the characters are united to overcome foe. The characters were brought together by a common benefactor is exceptionally common. A funeral brings the characters together. We see this constantly in television and film. A festival brings the characters together, which is much more lighthearted unless you're in Ravenloft. If it's Midsummer.
What are we getting together for? Yeah, right.
Boy.
And these are all options in Tasha's?
These are all party origin options in Tasha's that you can actually roll. The characters find themselves trapped together, which I've been thrust into many times, where we all get arrested. We're all in a dungeon.
You all got to. I'm like,
what
do you mean you've been thrust into? You did that to me. Like, you did that to us. We all got arrested together, and that was the inciting incident.
It was because it was done to me as a player at the beginning of that campaign. You were all mind flayers together.
It's that's how the greatest of friendships begin, being mind flayers together. I don't want to interrupt the list. I do have something to share, but I want to make sure. The patrons.
Those are the 6 options they provide, which are pretty standard. I feel options. But there's lots of other ways. I have started games out where everyone's the enemy of each other, which was deeply hilarious for a one-shot live stream. I don't know if that's always going to pan out. You got to trust your players, and your players have to trust each other. But it is pretty funny when everyone's like, bounty hunting. Like one of the characters, and one character is trying to assassinate the patron of another, and one's trying to steal something from that person. And I did set up a Star Wars campaign once that way, and it was so funny It just set the tone for the entire campaign that lasted 3 years. Very Guardians of the Galaxy, I would say.
Well, now I have two things to say. One, and this is just a general aside, that like when you're playing, try not to ever take anything that happens to your character personally. That can be very difficult. It absolutely has happened to me where things happen to my character that I was like full pearl clutch. But I mean, for the most part, the game is the game, and life is life. You're not them. But the other thing that I was just saying when we're talking about these group patrons, a trick I use a lot that I heard somewhere along the way, it was not my idea, but I do not know who to credit properly, is you get your players to give you a list of 3 or 4 things about their character that are true. And then you create 2 or 3 things that are false about them. And you mix it up and you give it to every other player at the table. So they've all heard things about each other. So then some of them will be true and some of them won't be true. And that is some of the most fertile seeds of role playing ever. It works out, especially because if one of the things you say about someone that isn't true is they've got this terrible temper once they're in their cups, and the first time they go to a tavern, this person gets into a fight, then everybody's like, I heard that about you, type thing. Yeah.
I think like that perspective on, say, Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones as the Kingslayer, that he's this horrible man without any kind of honor, and just murdered the king, and the king was totally great and totally fine. The Mad King, obviously great guy. I think that's a good example of like some false advertising, and I think that's pretty a great example. Joey, how do you like to start things? What are some of the ways that you like to start a game?
I wanted to touch on something that E-Dave said just a second ago, his first point about emotional bleed in RPGs, because this is a tough thing for people to talk about. So, which means it's a great thing to talk about at a session 0 when everyone's being totally open, and, all cards on the table. Because some people suffer from RP emotional bleed more than others, and even people who think that like, oh, that will never happen to me, sometimes they just get blindsided, struck in the middle of the forehead by an incredibly emotional moment that they can't let go of, and they'll be it'll be with them for a week, or maybe they'll be running into the next session with it, and they're still pissed off at another player because of something that shouldn't have, huge quote marks, affected them, but it has. And because of that, it's really important to know, I think, that session 0 can happen again at any time. It can happen again and again and again and again. The name session 0 is sometimes a little bit misleading, but it's a good name because every campaign should start with one. But you can have a session 0 in the middle of a campaign. You might want to have like a quarterly session 0 if you're a particularly organized dungeon master who always likes to be on the same page as their players, explicitly. If you're a player and you have suddenly encountered something that you don't that you weren't expecting, you want to talk out with other players, I think it's a perfectly viable option to say to your DM, probably say to your DM and privately, hey, let's have a session 0, just so that we can work out what happened. And it's not always easy.
No.
It can be hard to have these emotionally honest conversations, even for like adults.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think emotional bleed, that will definitely happen to people at the most unexpected of times, and that's fine. And that also comes down to, when a character dies, like that can be emotional, and very emotional after 3 years. You become long-term friends with these characters, and seeing them go, even if you're okay with it, it's going to make you emotional. And that's okay. Obviously to an extent. Don't don't break yourself on your own character. It's a good conversation to have with the players and the other dungeon masters as well. And that's all part of that social contract of understanding that.
Yeah, that this is a mask you're putting on, but it is not you. But, you know, by the same token, it makes sense that it happens too, because that's how our minds work. Our minds literally don't know the difference between something that is real and something that is vividly imagined. That's why thinking of a painful memory can make you sad now. Thinking of a happy memory can make you happy now. So when you're completely immersed in these things, realizing that that triggers the same parts of your brain, and sometimes your reptile brain is normal, but, you know, try and as much separation as possible. And also don't be afraid to exit a scene if you need to, you know, like if you need to back away, walk, go get a drink of water or something, like you can do that. Like it's okay.
Yeah. And every character, even the ones most distant from you, have a little bit of you in it. And maybe especially in characters that are very, very different from you, but have like a nugget of your soul, just this tiny little thing. If something bullseyes that bit of you, you might be like, I did not expect anything from my past to come up with this character of all people. And so you should never feel that shame for letting that sort of emotional bleed happen to you. You just need to be prepared to deal with it in, you know, an emotionally mature and responsible way with your good friends who you're playing D&D with.
And that will come up. And I've seen it happen to players at exceptionally unexpected times, both for them and for me seeing it happen. You just don't know, and sometimes you don't know. You're like, and Tasha does talk about this, and this is something everyone's known for a long time: is hard and soft limits. You'll be surprised what will come up in role playing, and that's good and it's healthy. Just, you know, try not to take anything too personally. Obviously, now there are obviously there is the potential to run into a toxic player around the table, and then there are a lot of things you can do to deal with that as well.